Look closely at the arch in the center of your city, the one you walk past every day. You have been told it is a monument to some general, a handsome legend, and completely untrue. For 200 years, plaques have been hung upon us. Napoleon, Wellington, Louis, the victory in the War of 1812. Convenient names, neatly nailed to stone, that conceals an entirely different history, the one the textbooks keep silent about. Because in Paris, in London, in Milan, in Petersburg, and even in the small Cossack town of Novocherkassk, stand arches built from a single blueprint, with identical proportions, with identical columns on either side, and all of them look at one another along straight lines across thousands of kilometers, across seas, mountains, and state borders. A provincial Russian town points directly at Cairo and at Libya. The arch in Blagoveshchensk points at Harbin in China, a city that did not yet exist at the moment of the arch's construction. Beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, the coffin of a writer lay for 10 days, and 2 million people came to bid him farewell, as if he had been a secret leader. And the Soviet authorities in the 30s demolished arches across Moscow with maniacal persistence. Why? What was wrong with ordinary stone monuments? The answer to all these questions is one, and it overturns everything you were taught at school. In this video, you will see maps, coordinates, and precise distances to the meter. You will see what is hidden by the symmetrical colonnades on either side of every arch. You will learn why the name of Milan is linked to a golden column in Istanbul, and you will understand what civilization stood on this land before us, and why not a single line about it remains in the textbooks. Do not skip ahead. Every minute is one more piece of evidence. And by the finale, a picture will come together that has been hidden from you all your life. Let us begin. 50 meters high, 45 meters wide, the Arc de Triomphe on the Place de l'Étoile stands in the center of Paris like a stone ultimatum. For 200 years, guides have repeated the same line. This is a monument to the military victories of Napoleon Bonaparte. For 200 years, millions of tourists have nodded and taken their photographs without asking a single real question. And the questions are there. The first concerns the axis. A single grand avenue runs through the Arc de l'Étoile and connects the Louvre, the Tuileries Gardens, the Place de la Concorde, and the Champs-Élysées into one perfectly straight line. No modern architect designs a city along such a rigid geometry by chance. This applies to every urban planner of the 19th and 20th centuries. A straight line of that length and that precision is always the result of calculation, never the whim of an emperor. Now comes the interesting part. Extend this axis on the map in both directions and the familiar picture falls apart. East-southeast takes the line from Paris through the Italian city of Verona, and from there it strikes Athens, the capital of ancient Greece, the cradle of European architecture, a city Napoleon never took and which had nothing to do with his campaigns. Coincidence? Perhaps, but coincidences end where the second axis begins. Perpendicular to the main avenue runs a second line, from north-northeast to south-southwest. Its northern end lands precisely on Amsterdam. Its southern end strikes Volubilis, an ancient city in northern Morocco, the ruins of a Roman provincial capital on the edge of the Atlas Mountains. This applies to facts that can be verified in 3 minutes on any mapping program. The line runs without deviation, across sea, across mountains, across borders, and arrives exactly where it arrives. 4 directions, 4 specific points: Athens, Verona, Amsterdam, Volubilis. And at the center, the arch. Architects and historians of urban planning have a specific term for such a structure. It is called a tetrapylon or tetraport, a 4-sided node, a construction at the crossing of 2 axes linking 4 different targets at once. Tetrapylons were built in the ancient world. Their remains are found in Syria, in Libya, in Asia Minor. And the Arc de l'Étoile, by its geometry, is a classical tetrapylon, only on a monumental scale, in the heart of a European capital. Official history refuses to engage with this fact. Its version runs as follows. The arch was commissioned in 1806 by Napoleon after the Battle of Austerlitz and finished under Louis Philippe in 1836. That means 30 years of continuous construction, 2 different rulers, a change of political regime, and despite all of that, the geometric axis was preserved with perfect accuracy. Men who could not agree on the form of the state somehow managed, without error, to hold the line on Athens and Volubilis. This applies to a question that official historiography prefers to avoid. If the axis was laid out under Napoleon for the sake of military victories, why does it point to Morocco, where he never campaigned, and to Greece, which was none of his concern? If the axis was laid after Napoleon, why preserve directions that had lost their meaning? There is no answer, or rather, there is one, but a different one. The axis was drawn long before Napoleon. The arch was simply placed into a coordinate grid that already existed. The emperor and his successors wrote their own biography into a much older pre-existing system. Look at the distances. From Paris to Athens in a straight line, roughly 2,000 kilometers. To Volubilis, around 2,100. To Amsterdam, 430. To Verona, 850. The numbers differ, the directions differ, but the line is one. And this line could not have appeared on its own at the sweep of an imperial sword. It was drawn by people who held the map of the continent in their heads, not a handful of battlefields. This applies to a level of engineering culture which should not have existed in Napoleonic Europe, with its goose quills, telescopes and horses as the main means of transport. Add one more detail. The Arc de l'Étoile stands on a hill that used to be called Chaillot. From this point, a clear view really does open in all 4 directions. And the location was chosen with engineering precision, not for beauty, not for royal caprice, but by the laws of geodesy. A tetrapylon, by definition, demands a commanding height and open lines of sight. The hill of Chaillot provides both. And once again the awkward question returns. Who chose this place? And when? And why exactly in the way an ancient engineering tradition would have required? The argument of random coincidence does not hold here. 1 coincidence, fine. 2, already a stretch. 4 precise strikes into 4 capital and hub cities, plus a geometrically correct hill, plus an axis preserved through 30 years of construction, plus the architectural canon of a tetrapylon. This is not coincidence. This is a system. And this system is older than Napoleon, older than Louis, older than the Capetians. It is older than France itself in the form taught in schools. The Paris Arch is the first and most obvious point on the map where the official version breaks against its own geometry. Other points will follow: London, Milan, Munich, St. Petersburg, Novocherkassk. Each has its own axis, each has its own directions, and each reveals the same inconvenient pattern. The line never ends in empty space. The 22nd of May, 1885. Paris comes to a halt. Victor Hugo, whom school textbooks present as a kindly grey-haired novelist, the author of Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, reaches the end of his earthly journey in a mansion on Avenue des Lots. He is 83 years old, and what follows is precisely what official biographies rush past in a single sentence, though it deserves to be broken down point by point. Hugo's coffin is not placed in a church, not in the academy, not yet in the Pantheon. It is placed beneath the Arc de Triomphe on the Place de l'Étoile, beneath the very structure officially considered a monument to the military glory of Napoleon. A writer, under the arch of an emperor. A strange choice if one takes the textbook version at face value. This applies to a simple rule of state symbolism. Just anyone does not get laid under the principal monument of a nation. The farewell lasts not a day, not 2, not 3. It lasts 10 full days. 10 days and nights, under heavy guard, with torches burning around the clock, with an uninterrupted flow of people. The Parisian newspapers of the period, Le Figaro, Le Temps, Le Petit Journal, all give the same figure. More than 2 million people pass through the mourning canopy beneath the arch. 2 million. The population of Paris at the time is roughly 2.5 million. Almost the entire city came, and with it, tens of thousands of visitors from the provinces and from abroad. Now, an honest question. Has anyone in the history of Western Europe ever seen an ordinary writer, however famous, bid farewell in this manner? 10 days beneath the main arch of the country, 2 million people in line, torches, guards, a state mourning. This applies to the level of a monarch's funeral, not a novelist's. Ceremonies of such scale are reserved for men who meant, in the eyes of the people, something incomparably greater than what their passport said. The school version of Hugo's biography is tidy and harmless. Born in Besançon, wrote poetry and novels, supported the Republic, was in exile under Napoleon III, returned to France in 1870, engaged in public affairs, and that is more or less all. Enough for the enthusiasm of literary critics, perhaps, but nowhere near enough for a queue of 2 million. There are, however, details that do not make it into the school account. Hugo held the title of Peer of France, meaning he belonged to the uppermost layer of the state elite, among those who made decisions on the fate of the nation. This applies to the period of the July monarchy, when a peerage carried real political power and not a decorative label. Hugo was not merely a writer who happened to sign things. He was one of the men who shaped the very frame within which France existed in the first half of the 19th century. Then, exile. After the coup of Napoleon III in 1851, Hugo flees France and spends almost 20 years on the islands of Jersey and Guernsey in the English Channel. Official biographies call this political emigration, a convenient formulation that explains nothing. Why did the new regime push a writer, of all people, so persistently out of the country? Why did Napoleon III's police keep Hugo's house on Guernsey under surveillance through informants? Why, on his return to Paris in 1870, was he greeted not by literary admirers, but by a crowd of many thousands at the railway station, shouting in welcome as they would greet a leader, not the author of poetry collections? The version that answers all these questions at once sounds uncomfortable. According to it, Hugo was not so much a writer as one of the key figures of the resistance, a leader of that part of French society which remembered the old European civilization, the one whose nodes were the tetrapylons and the triumphal arches, and refused to accept the new order established after the upheavals of the early 19th century. In this version, literary activity served Hugo as cover and instrument, not as the main content of his life. This applies to a time-tested practice of every serious opposition. Poems and novels on the surface, political work underneath, a network, influence, the safeguarding of memory about the former age. Then everything falls into place. The 20 years of exile, the surveillance of his house, the scale of his return to Paris, the fact that after his life ended, the coffin was placed precisely beneath the Arc de Triomphe rather than in some more literary location. The 2 million people in a 10-day queue. The later decision to transfer Hugo's remains to the Pantheon, a building officially considered the tomb of the great men of France, but in fact a former church of Sainte-Geneviève, rebuilt during the Great French Revolution for entirely different purposes. Add one more figure. During the funeral procession from the Arc de Triomphe to the Pantheon, a column roughly 5 kilometers long stretched through the streets of Paris. Troops kept order along the way. All traffic in the center of the city was completely halted. This applies to the level of state machinery switched on only for a figure of national scale, not a literary one. The official version insists, simply a very popular writer, simply much loved by the people. Let that stand. But neither Balzac, nor Flaubert, nor Dumas received anything of the kind during their lifetimes or after their journeys ended. None of them lay under the Arc de Triomphe. None gathered a 2 million strong queue. None brought Paris to a stop for 10 full days. So the matter is not the popularity of the novels. The matter is who Hugo was for those who came to say farewell. And they were not, it seems, his readers. They were people who considered him one of their own, their leader, their voice, the last great representative of a vanishing age. Beneath the Arc de Triomphe in May of 1885, the crowd was not parting with a man of letters. It was parting with a man whose real place in history was never told to us, and the place was not chosen by chance. The Arc de l'Étoile, on which 2 million people gazed for 10 days, is that same point, that same summit of the Chaillot Hill, through which runs the geometric axis pointing to Athens, Amsterdam, and Volubilis, one of the principal surviving nodes of the former system. The farewell to Hugo beneath this arch was not an accidental gesture, but a very precise one. It was as if he was being returned to the place where, by right, he had belonged all his life. Let us move from the western part of Paris to the north. There, at the junction of the Boulevard Saint-Denis and the street of the same name, stands another triumphal arch, the Porte Saint-Denis. Height 24.5 meters, width 25. Material limestone. The date of construction, according to every official reference book, is 1672. The patron, Louis XIV, the Sun King. The occasion, military victories in the Franco-Dutch War, in particular the crossing of the Rhine and the taking of several towns in the Netherlands. The version sounds smooth until the viewer lifts his head and looks closely at what is actually carved in the stone. Because the language of symbols on the Porte Saint-Denis tells a story that coincides with the biography of the French king only in the loosest sense. This applies to a rule well known to anyone who has ever studied heraldry and architectural decoration. Stone does not lie. Stone says exactly what the patron has put into it, and it cannot be read at whim. What do we see on the arch? First, a lion. A lion at full height, powerful, with a flared mane, taking a central position in one of the compositions. A heraldic lion is a symbol of empire, not of France, not of the House of Bourbon, not of Louis personally. The coat of arms of royal France of the period carries 3 golden lilies on an azure field. Lilies, not lions. In the European heraldic tradition of the 17th century, the lion is firmly attached to imperial themes, to England in her continental claims, to a number of German states, to Spain in her Habsburg period. But above all, the lion was the common mark of that supranational empire which, according to the unofficial version, existed before the upheavals of the early 19th century. Second, cornucopias. They are shown on the side reliefs in the hands of female figures, filled with fruit, ears of grain, grapes, a classical ancient symbol of prosperity, of domestic abundance, of peaceful welfare. This applies to an imagery which in the Roman tradition accompanied not military triumphs, but long and stable ages of quiet governance. On an arch supposedly raised in honor of a military campaign, cornucopias stand next to weapons. A strange pairing, unless one knows that these horns of plenty originally belonged to another epoch and another state. Third, an oar. An oar on a monument erected in honor of the land victories of Louis looks like a plain inconsistency. An oar is the sign of a naval power, of dominion over rivers and oceans, of control over waterways. Louis XIV waged his wars predominantly on land, and his army was famed for its infantry, cavalry, and engineering sieges, not for its fleet. The fleet under him was only beginning to form and was far from reaching the level of a world maritime force. Yet the ore is already there. The ore is already carved into the stone, as though it belongs to a power that had held the waterways long and confidently. Now the most curious part. On the northern side of the arch, the vanquished nations are depicted. Bowed female figures, bound trophies, crowns and shields cast to the ground. On the southern side, the victors. Standing figures, raised banners, allegories of strength and order. This applies to a firm scheme of imperial monuments. Arches in Rome were framed in this way under the emperors of the flourishing age. Compositions were built in this way in Constantinople, and stones were worked in this way in the Hellenistic capitals. The scheme is older than Louis by 1,500 years, and it is applied to his Parisian gate as if the designer had before him not a royal commission, but a ready-made canon inherited from someone else. And finally, the lady on the obelisk. In the upper part of the composition is placed a female figure holding the attributes of power. The official reading is modest and vague. She is an allegory of France, or of victory, or of glory, depending on which reference one opens. But this lady has a more precise reading, which school textbooks do not cite. She symbolizes the new order. That very order which came to replace the former one, and which required monumental confirmation in stone. A queen of the new time, a new mother of the state, a new pillar, and she is placed at the very top, above the vanquished and the victors, as the conclusion and the verdict of the whole composition. Let us now put the picture together. On an arch supposedly dedicated to the military victories of the French king in the 1670s, we see an imperial lion, ancient cornucopias, a maritime oar, a Roman scheme of the vanquished and the victors, and a female figure representing the new order. Not one specifically French, not one specifically Bourbon, not one personally Louisian mark, not a single lily at the center of the composition, not a single sun, while Louis himself styled the Sun King and placed that luminary on everything he could reach. The conclusion is obvious. The Porte Saint-Denis was built either before Louis or during his reign, but according to an older design and with the use of an older symbolism belonging to another, longer-lived empire. The king simply stepped next to a monument already in place, attributed it to his own wars, and fixed that version in the official chronicles. This applies to the typical practice of every new power taking the place of an old one, not to destroy the former signs, but to reinterpret their meaning. In this way, memory is displaced. In this way, the former reign is rewritten into decoration for the present one. The hint at the catastrophe of the 19th century is hidden here in a single phrase: the new order. Because a new order exists only where there was an old one, and if the lady of the new order already stands on a stone of the late 17th century, it means that the change of epochs by that moment had already taken place or was about to take place. The former civilization, with its lions, its cornucopias and its ore, was still living out its last decades under a new signboard. What exactly happened to it further, in the 19th century, is a separate and large subject, but its traces, carved into the stone of the Parisian gate, still stand on the Boulevard Saint-Denis to this day, and they look at passers-by with precisely the gaze with which they looked at them 350 years ago. Paris is not an exception. Paris is only the first letter in a long list. Because the very same picture appears the moment we move to the south of France, cross the English Channel, and look into the Iberian Peninsula. Everywhere the same thing. Triumphal arches, erected supposedly in honor of local heroes, on closer inspection, point not at their own city, but at foreign capitals 1 and 2,000 kilometers away. This applies to the principle we already saw on the Arc de l'Étoile. The line never ends in empty space. Let us begin with Marseille. The second largest city of France, the country's principal Mediterranean port, a city of roughly 860,000 inhabitants. In the very heart of Old Marseille stands the Porte d'Aix, a monumental triumphal gate some 18 meters high, with a classical arched opening and a rich sculptural decor. The official date of construction, the first half of the 19th century. The official pretext, the memory of Napoleon's campaigns in Spain and the victories of his successors. The usual, standard package of explanations. Now look at the axis of the Porte d'Aix on the map. The axis of the structure is oriented so that its extension reaches out in two arms. One arm leads to Maktar, a small but remarkably telling ancient city in central Tunisia, on the territory of what was Roman Africa. This applies to the same layer of facts as Volubilis, North African ancient centers linked by straight geometric lines to the largest cities of Europe. The second arm of the Porte d'Aix axis crosses the whole of France and the English Channel and lands precisely on London. Marseille and London joined by a single straight line, not by ships, not by a railway, not by a trade route, by a line drawn in stone. Move on to the British Isles. In London, there survives not one arched structure of this type, but several at once, and each of them obeys the same logic. Let us take first the Wellington Arch, standing at the edge of Hyde Park, on the corner of Hyde Park Corner. Height, about 25 meters, with the famous bronze quadriga on the summit, drawn by 4 horses. Officially, the arch is dedicated to Arthur, Duke of Wellington, the victor over Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. By the textbook, pure British military glory. Now the axis. The line running through the Wellington Arch goes east and northeast and lands exactly on St. Petersburg, on the capital of the Russian Empire, on a city roughly 2,150 kilometers from London in a straight line. This applies to the category of coincidences one can no longer believe in. 2 imperial cities, 2 symbolic centers of their states, linked by the geometry of their principal arches. We continue through London. The Marble Arch, standing at the northeastern corner of Hyde Park. White Carrara marble, 3 openings, some 15 meters high. Built, according to official history, in 1827 as the ceremonial entrance to Buckingham Palace, and in 1851 moved to its present location. The pretext, ceremonial, courtly, decorative. The axis of the Marble Arch goes east and northeast and lands on Tartu, an old Estonian city, one of the cradles of the Baltic scholarly tradition, formerly known as Eurasien. London and Tartu, the Marble Arch, and a small Estonian city 2,000 kilometers away. The line runs precisely. The third London monument is the Admiralty Arch, closing the view down the Mall, the ceremonial avenue leading to Buckingham Palace. Built in 1912. 5 openings, a massive Portland stone facade, maritime sculptural decor. Official purpose, a memorial to Queen Victoria and at the same time an administrative building. The axis of the arch runs in 2 directions. One arm, once again to Tartu. That is, the same point is fixed a second time, now by a second London structure. The other arm goes west and southwest and vanishes into the Atlantic Ocean, into a region where, according to official geography, there is only water and nothing more. This applies to a separate observation, which we shall not explore in detail here, but let us note it. A whole series of European arches have axes striking into the Atlantic in the direction of points where, according to certain historical hypotheses, a former continental landmass once lay. 2 London arches point to the same Tartu. One London arch points to St. Petersburg. Marseille points to London and into Tunisia. Paris points to Athens, Amsterdam, Volubilis. Already 5 European structures. Already 11 precise hits into specific cities. Not a single miss, not a single blurred direction, not a single line running into empty space. And finally, Madrid, the capital of Spain, the center of a former immense colonial empire. Several triumphal arched structures survive in the city. The most famous among them is the Puerta de Alcalá, the Gate of Alcalá, built in 1778 according to the design of the architect Francesco Sabatini under King Charles III. Height, roughly 30 meters, 5 openings, a monumental granite facade. Officially, a ceremonial entry into the city from the side of Alcalá de Henares. The pretext, the honor of the king and solemn urban architecture. The axis of the gate, however, behaves in exactly the same way as all the others. Its extension runs east and lands on other European cities, precisely along the same grid that governs the Parisian, Marseille, and London monuments. This applies to a general rule which can now be stated firmly. A triumphal arch is not a monument to a local victory, but a point on a single European coordinate grid. Let us draw a line under the list, but not under the subject. Paris, Athens, Amsterdam, Volubilis. Marseille, Maktar, London. London, St. Petersburg, Tartu, the Atlantic Ocean. Madrid, the eastern direction, other European nodes. The map begins to draw itself. These are no longer isolated anomalies or individual architectural quirks. This is a network, consistent, geometrically verified, covering the whole of Western Europe, North Africa, and the eastern approaches to the continent. A network in which every major city has its own arch, its own direction, and its own correspondent at the far end of a straight line. And what is particularly inconvenient for official history, all these lines operate by one canon, one architectural type, one set of proportions, one scheme of porticos, one principle of orientation. As if all these monuments, scattered across different eras and different countries, had been designed from a single common blueprint. This applies to a level of engineering continuity which, within the framework of ordinary European history of the 18th and 19th centuries, has no normal explanation. But it is explained very well if one allows that the project was much older than any of the kings named here. So far we have been speaking of separate arches. One point here, one point there. Paris, Marseille, London, Madrid. Each city contributed 1 or 2 monuments to the overall picture. Now we move to Milan, and the picture changes radically. Because Milan is no longer a single arch. Milan is an entire urban complex, designed as one unified geometric system. A portal city in miniature, where along a single metropolitan axis, one can trace the whole architecture of the former network. To begin with, a few numbers. Milan is the second most significant city of Italy after Rome, the economic capital of the country, a metropolis with a population of roughly 1,400,000 within its administrative limits, and more than 5 million across the agglomeration. The historic center of Milan is compact, regularly planned, with clearly defined belts of development. And it is precisely within these belts that the whole structure of interest to us is preserved. This applies to an urbanistic fact easily verified on any map. Milan is arranged not chaotically, but according to a rigid concentric scheme, one that does not simply occur in a medieval town that grew by accident. At the center stands the Castello Sforzesco, a massive red brick fortress with powerful towers, a rectangular courtyard, and a complex system of inner courts and galleries. Officially built in the 15th century on the commission of the Sforza family, on the site of an earlier Visconti stronghold. But what is interesting here is not the biography of the rulers, but the role of the structure itself within the overall urban geometry. The Castello Sforzesco occupies the exact geometric heart of Old Milan. It is a gem set within a ring, the core around which the rest of the structure is built up. And around this core, the city is girded not by one, but by several successive rings of streets and walls. The first ring, the closest to the center, built into it were the inner city gates, from which today essentially the names of the districts and a few arched fragments survive. The second ring, more extended and far more interesting from a geometric point of view. It has a shape close to that of an octagon, 8 sides, 8 corners, 8 directions. Such a configuration is extremely rare in medieval European fortification. Standard city walls were made either circular or square, or following the terrain. Here, a regular octagon. This applies to planning solutions whose roots reach into ancient and even pre-ancient engineering tradition, where octagonal schemes were used in sacred and astronomical structures. Octagonal domes, octagonal rotundas, octagonal baptistries, and in Milan, an entire urban ring built on the same scheme. And along this octagonal ring, the 4 principal triumphal gate arches are placed. Not 1, not 2, but exactly 4. At the cardinal points of the compass, with measured distances between them and with measured orientations of their axes. This applies to the classical scheme of a tetrapylon, only unfolded not inside a single building, as in Paris, but distributed across 4 points on the scale of the entire city. If in Paris, the 4-sided node is concentrated in a single arc de l'étoile, in Milan it is spread among 4 separate structures. The result is the same: 4 directions, 4 external correspondents, 4 rays running beyond the city. Let us list these arches. The first is Porta Nuova, the new gate, in the northern section of the old ring. The second is Porta Ticinese Antica, the Ticinese gate in its older version, in the south. The third is the Gate of St. Ambrose, Porta Sant'Ambrogio, in the west, dedicated to the patron saint of Milan. The fourth is the Roman Gate, Porta Romana, facing southeast, in the direction of Rome. 4 monuments, 4 directions, each along an axis that can be extended on a map to yield a specific external city toward which the line runs. This applies to the same principle already worked out on Paris, Marseille, and London. An arch does not stand by itself, an arch looks at someone. To this square of 4 classical gates is added one more structure, Porta Garibaldi, a 3-arch triumphal gate built in the 19th century in the northern part of the city, with a distinctive monumental facade and, of particular importance, with surviving porticos on either side. Porticos, that is, extended colonnades and covered galleries symmetrically adjoining the central archway. The height of the arch is about 25 meters. The official version, a gate renamed in honor of Giuseppe Garibaldi after the unification of Italy in the 19th century. The unofficial detail, the geometric orientation of Porta Garibaldi, like that of all the other Milanese gates, points to specific external cities rather than to the surrounding fields. Now the key word, porticos. It appears in our account for the first time, and from this moment we shall meet it constantly. Porticos are not a decoration. They are not a tribute to ancient fashion. They are an essential structural component of the portal arches, one of their functional elements. In Milan, porticos survive on a number of gates either completely or in part. In addition to Porta Garibaldi, one should name Porta Nuova, with its surviving lateral galleries, Porta Venezia, with its characteristic symmetrical wings, Porta Ticinese, and the famous Arch of Peace, Arco della Pace, with its powerful colonnade and a spacious square before it. This applies to a group of structures that have retained the greatest number of original structural elements of the former system. The remaining arches and gates of Europe and Russia either lost their porticos during rebuildings or acquired shortened, decorative versions of them. Let us bring the picture of Milan together. At the center, the Castello Sforzesco, the core, the gem. Around it, the first ring of streets with the inner gates. Beyond that, the second ring in the form of a regular octagon, along which the four principal gate arches are placed. On the northern axis, a fifth structure, Porta Garibaldi, with its surviving porticos. The overall configuration is obvious to the naked eye. This is a star-shaped structure, a center, rays, nodes on the circumference, symmetrical elements along the cardinal points. The same logic by which the ancient tetrapylons were built, only unfolded on the scale of a city. The name of the city adds a final touch to this picture. Milan in Italian is written Milano, and one of the versions of the origin of this word links it to a Latin root, the same one from which the word mile is derived. A mile is a unit of distance, and not an ordinary one, but precisely a Roman imperial unit, tied to a system of state roads and measurements. In the Byzantine capital, in Constantinople, Istanbul, there existed a famous milion, a golden column from which distances were measured to every significant city of the empire, the 0 point of a world road system. And the name of Milan, according to one hypothesis, is linked to the same semantic root, to the point from which space is measured. This applies to the category of etymological coincidences, which at a distance of 2,000 years no longer appear accidental. If one accepts this logic, then Milan is not merely a beautiful Italian city, and not merely the economic capital of modern Italy. Milan is a former metropolitan node of a great continental system, which claimed the role of the center of Europe in the age when new territories were being opened up and new roads were being laid down. A city where everything is preserved at once: the central core, the concentric rings, the octagonal geometry, the four gates at the cardinal points, the porticos as a technical component, and the very name that hints at a system of measurement. No other European metropolis has preserved such a complete set. This is why Milan matters in our conversation. This applies to the fact that it is precisely in Milan that one can most conveniently observe how the former system looked as a whole, and not only in fragments. Up to this point, we have been examining the arches as navigational nodes. Geometry, axes, directions, precise hits on specific cities 1,000 and 2,000 kilometers away. This explains where the arches point. But it does not explain why such a grid is needed at all if it cannot be used for communication. And if it can be used, then exactly how? Here we come to what we have been saving for last: the porticos. Those very symmetrical colonnades on either side of the central archway, which school history describes as a decorative element in the ancient taste. Let us look at them once more, and without a textbook in hand. What do we see physically? Two symmetrical wings placed on either side of the arch at equal distance. Each wing has an extended colonnade, a stone covering, and an internal chamber. The distance between the porticos is strictly measured and remains the same at gates across the whole of Europe. The material is dense stone, often granite or hard limestone, with metal elements in the structural joints. The orientation of the porticos is such that their inner axes converge precisely along the central axis of the arch, along the very geodesic line that we have already learned to extend as far as Athens, Amsterdam, and Volubilis. The official interpretation sounds simple. The porticos are there to make the arch look ceremonial. Ancient fashion, classicism, a reference to the Roman tradition. Apparently pretty and nothing more. But there is one inconvenient detail. In every case where the porticos have survived in their original form, they carry the same technical feature. They have a massive base, further reinforced. They contain internal cavities described in official reference books in vague terms: service premises or guard rooms. and their construction is calculated in such a way that two opposite porticos operate as a single pair, symmetrically, in coordination, with identical geometric parameters on both sides. This applies to an engineering principle that ordinary decorative architecture does not require. For beauty, approximate symmetry is enough. For function, only precision will do. And here enters the hypothesis around which the whole unofficial version of the subject is built. According to this hypothesis, the porticos were not a decoration, but a technical device. In essence, the transformer stations of the former system. Two symmetrical stations working synchronously, each on its side of the archway. Inside was placed equipment whose exact purpose is unknown to us, but whose general principle of operation can be reconstructed from indirect signs. The porticos emitted into the space before the arch certain oscillations. The nature of these oscillations is described differently by different authors within this subject. Most often the reference is to an electromagnetic field of a particular frequency and form. The emission of the two porticos proceeded simultaneously, in phase, aimed toward one another. And at the point where the two counter-running waves crossed, precisely at the center of the archway, there formed what in physics is called a standing wave. Let us clarify the term. A standing wave arises when two waves of the same frequency and amplitude travel in opposite directions and overlap. As a result, points appear in space where oscillations are reinforced to the maximum, and points where they are entirely cancelled out. The classical example is a string of a musical instrument, where over a particular length, a stable pattern of vibration forms with fixed nodes. If one transfers this principle from a two-dimensional string to the three-dimensional square before the arch, one obtains a space with a stable wave structure right within the archway. A region with distinctive physical properties differing from the ordinary space around it. According to this hypothesis, it was this very region that the portal used. The central axis of the arch, running precisely along the line of the standing wave, became a channel of communication with a similar region at another arch on the far end of the geometric line. Paris, Athens, London, St. Petersburg, Marseille, Maktar. Two arches standing on one straight line, with synchronously operating porticos on either side, formed a pair of linked nodes. Signal, substance, flow. It is impossible to say precisely, but a connection that required no horses, no sails, no railways. This applies to a level of technology which, within the framework of the official history of the European 18th, let alone 17th century, is not even considered seriously. Let us add a few further observations which, in such a picture, cease to be accidental. First, the layout of the squares before the arches. It is almost always a large, open space of regular shape, often flanked by symmetrical buildings. No random infill, no houses closer than a certain distance. If the arches were merely decorative, no one would guard this space so strictly. But for the operation of a standing wave, a free area of the required configuration is essential. Stray massive objects would distort the radiation pattern. Second, the unified architectural canon. Identical proportions of the porticos, identical distances between them, identical height of the archway. This is not a matter of fashion. This is a matter of compatibility. Equipment operating on the same technical parameters demands exactly these geometric dimensions, not approximate ones. This applies to the engineering rule by which, for instance, modern antenna arrays are built. A deviation of a few centimeters already disrupts the radiation pattern. Third, the sudden and massive failure of this whole system in the 19th century. According to official history, the arches of that period were being restored, rebuilt, occasionally demolished. According to the unofficial version, it was precisely then that the portals were deliberately taken out of operation. First, the equipment in the porticos was destroyed or mutilated. Then the porticos themselves were dismantled, supposedly on grounds of dilapidation. Then the arch was left standing alone, without its technical wings, like a beautiful but no longer functioning monument. And by the 20th century, the vast majority of European and Russian arches had come down to us precisely in that form, without porticos or with their truncated decorative remnants. A mere handful have survived in their original completeness. Milan, with its Porta Garibaldi and Arch of Peace, is one of those rare exceptions. Now all the parts of our discussion can be assembled into a single construction. The geometry of the axes, the precision of the hits on foreign cities, the tetrapylons, the octagonal rings, the central cores such as the Castello Sforzesco. This is the level of planning. The porticos, the synchronous emission, the standing wave within the archway. This is the level of operation. The unified architectural canon, common to Paris, London, Milan, St. Petersburg, and faraway Blagoveshchensk in the Russian Far East. This is the level of the standard without which such a network cannot function. And the massive dismantling of this network in the 19th century is the level of a historical event that never made it into the textbooks. This applies to a simple conclusion. If one allows that the portals really did work, then everything else in this story, from the geometry of the étoile to the farewell to Victor Hugo, ceases to be a collection of curiosities and becomes fragments of a single lost technological civilization. Let us now walk through Milan on foot and see what exactly has reached our time in original form. Because an abstract discussion about porticos becomes truly convincing only when the reader sees a named list of the surviving structures. And Milan, in this sense, gives us unique material. No other European metropolis has preserved so many elements of the former system at once. This applies to a simple observation. Paris has preserved the geometry, London has preserved the axes, and Milan has preserved the technical components themselves in their physical form. The first object, Porta Nuova, not to be confused with the modern high-rise district of the same name in the northern part of the city, which took its name from the historic gate. We are speaking of the actual old gate standing on the northern axis. The structure includes a central archway and the characteristic symmetrical lateral wings, which are the very porticos in question. The material is dense pale stone with a massive reinforced base at the lower part. The height of the main arch is about 17 meters. The square before the gate is kept open, with no large buildings in immediate proximity. This applies to the preservation of the very free space that is necessary for the operation of the emission, if one accepts the hypothesis of the standing wave. The second object, Porta Venezia, the Venetian gate. It stands on the eastern side of the old ring, facing toward the Adriatic coast. The structure consists of two symmetrical propylaea-style buildings placed on either side of a wide roadway, with colonnades of the Corinthian order, stone coverings and internal premises. These are not merely decorative pavilions, as one might think at first glance. These are full two-part porticos, two synchronous wings standing in precise symmetry to one another. The distance between them is measured. Their heights coincide to the centimetre. The orientation of their internal axes converges strictly along the central line of the passage. Official dating fixes the present appearance of the gate in the 19th century. But the character of the masonry, the proportions and the technical solutions employed clearly indicate an older foundation, reworked and redecorated in modern times. The third object, Porta Ticinese. Milan has two versions of this gate. The older, known as Porta Ticinese Antica, and the newer one. It is the newer that interests us here, built in the first half of the 19th century on the southern axis of the city, toward the Ticino River and further on toward the Swiss Alps. The gate takes the form of two parallel Ionic propylaea, between which runs a wide road. Each of the two wings is a classical portico with columns, covering and stone masonry. The configuration is the same as at Porta Venezia, two synchronous stations on either side of the central axis, and once again, an open square in front, no dense infill, no random building. This applies to the principle of preserving functional geometry, which the authorities of Milan observe to this day, even if officially they no longer know why it was needed in the first place. The fourth object, and perhaps the most imposing, the Arch of Peace, Arco della Pace. It stands in the western part of the city, on an axis continuing toward France. The height of the monument is about 25 meters, the width about 24. The material is marble and granite. The central span has 3 openings, crowned by a powerful attic with a quadriga of peace on the summit. But the main thing is not the arch itself, but what lies before it. A vast rectangular square, free of building, with symmetrical colonnades along the sides and a precisely measured geometry. Those lateral colonnades are the very surviving porticos, in monumental form and with the maximum observance of all proportions. The Arch of Peace, in this sense, is the most complete of the Milanese portals. It has preserved everything: the central archway, the symmetrical lateral elements, the open square, and the orientation of the axis on an external city. So then, 4 objects: Porta Nuova, Porta Venezia, Porta Ticinese, the Arch of Peace, plus the already mentioned Porta Garibaldi, plus separate fragments and sections at other city gates that have come down to us in part. For one city, an unparalleled concentration. This applies to the assessment of Milan as the principal reference point within the entire subject of portal arches. Neither Paris, nor London, nor Madrid, nor St. Petersburg gives us so many complete surviving complexes at once. Now for the name of the city itself. Milan in Italian is Milano, in Latin Mediolanum. The official etymology derives the name from a combination of 2 roots meaning roughly the middle of the plain or the center of the land. Already in this official version, one hears a characteristic motif, a city at the center. But alongside the main etymology, there exists another, more interesting for our conversation. According to it, the root of the word Milan is connected to the Latin mille, meaning thousand, and to its derivative miliarium, thousandth, mile, a roadside column marking the distance. The mile is a unit of distance that is not accidental, but belongs to the state. The Roman mile, mille passuum, equaled 1,000 double paces and was used for the measurement of the imperial roads. Across the entire territory of the Roman Empire, at each mile stood a stone column with the distance to the principal centers inscribed upon it. And in the very capital of Byzantium, in Constantinople, there existed a particular column, the million. It was not an ordinary milestone, but a gilded column installed at the Augustan beside the Hagia Sophia, from which distances were counted to all the most important cities of the empire. The 0 point of the imperial road system. The point from space begins, and the name of Milan, within this logic, ceases to be a merely accidental toponym. It is built into the same semantic family as the Roman miliarium and the Byzantine million, a city whose name goes back to the idea of a roadside column, to a 0 point from which distances are measured. This applies to an etymological parallel which classical scholarship prefers to pass over, but which within our subject sounds like a detail that occupies exactly the place assigned to it in the overall picture. Let us draw the conclusion. Milan has preserved 4 key porticos in original or near original form. Milan keeps the open squares before the arches despite the pressure of modern building. Milan is arranged on a concentric scheme with a central fortress, an octagonal ring, and 4 gates at the cardinal points. Milan carries a name etymologically linked to the 0 point of an imperial road system. By the sum of all these features, Milan, within the version under examination, stands not as one European city among many, but as a claimant to the role of the former capital of Europe in the age of the opening up of new territories. a former principal node of the whole network, from which rays extended toward Paris, London, Madrid, the North African centres, and further on to the east. This applies to a conclusion for which etymology alone would be insufficient, but which, in combination with the architecture, the geometry, and the preservation of the porticos, forms a picture entirely coherent. And this is why, within this subject, one has to return to Milan again and again. No other points as complete as this remain on the map. After Milan, it is logical to move north to the capital of Bavaria. Munich, within the framework of our subject, is no less interesting than the Milanese complex, and in some respects even more so. Because if in Milan the former system has been preserved in the form of gates and porticos, in Munich we are faced with a different situation, still more inconvenient for official history. In Munich, ancient structures are directly presented as works of the 19th century, adapted, restored, re-equipped and furnished with new plaques bearing new dates. This applies to the very device we have already seen at the Porte Saint-Denis, not to demolish what is old, but to rewrite it under a new patron. Only in Munich, this device has been carried to its logical conclusion. Let us begin with numbers and location. The population of Munich is roughly 1,400,000. It is the third largest city of Germany after Berlin and Hamburg, the historical center of Bavaria, one of the principal nodes of southern Europe. At the very heart of the city lies the King's Square, in German, Königsplatz. A vast open space of regular rectangular form, framed on three sides by monumental buildings. No random construction, no adjoining residential houses at the minimum distance, no chaotic growth. Everything is measured, everything is symmetrical, everything is subordinated to a single compositional axis. Now, what stands on this square? In order. On the eastern side, the massive siege store, or Victory Gate. Height, about 21 meters. Width, about 24. A central archway plus two lateral openings. On the summit, a quadriga drawn by 4 lions. The lion, we should recall, is the imperial heraldic symbol, the very one we have already encountered on the Parisian Porte Saint-Denis. Not eagles, not horsemen, not lilies, not local Bavarian emblems, but precisely lions. Officially, the Siegestor is dated to the middle of the 19th century and is linked to the Bavarian king Ludwig I. Unofficially, by the character of the masonry, the proportions and the symbolic content, the gate looks considerably older than its plaques. On the western side of the square stand the propylaea. This is already a monumental structure of another order entirely. A central passage with Doric columns, 2 lateral wings with extending colonnades, the whole in pure ancient Greek stylistics. The height of the central section is about 21 meters, the overall width of the complex some 60 meters. The material is white limestone, in certain parts marble. The official date is also the mid-19th century. The architect, Leo von Klenz, the same who designed the new Hermitage wing in St. Petersburg. The official purpose, a ceremonial gate and a symbol of Greco-Bavarian ties, through which King Ludwig expressed his love for classical Greece. It is precisely around the propylaea that the most interesting part of our discussion begins, because by the whole combination of indications, this structure does not look like a new building in the ancient style, but like an ancient building that has undergone restoration and received a new function. Look at the details. The proportions of the columns conform not to later classical stylizations, but to the exact canons of the ancient Greek order. The masonry of the lower courses differs from the material of the upper parts, a typical indication of a structure built up at a later date upon an older foundation. The wear of the stone at the base and at the upper friezes does not coincide in character, which in a building of a single period is difficult to explain. This applies to observations that are not emphasized in academic history of architecture, but which, within our subject, add up to a consistent picture. To this is added one important detail. On either side of the proper layer on the square stand two symmetrical buildings with colonnades. One is called the Glyptothek, the other the State Collection of Antiquities. Officially, these are museums of antiquities, built in the first half of the 19th century specifically to house classical collections. Both buildings have facades with porticos, both are placed in strict symmetry relative to the central axis of the square. Both maintain, together with the proper layer, a single geometric scheme. This applies to the picture we already know from Milan, a central archway structure plus two symmetrical lateral wings with porticos forming a single complex. The Königsplatz in Munich, by its structure, is the same tetrapylon node that we analysed in Paris and in the Milanese octagon, only in an even more transparent and compact arrangement. And here a hypothesis arises which breaks the official dating. The proper layer, together with the two lateral wings, could have been not built in the 19th century, but adapted. Found, cleared of later deposits, partly built up, furnished with new internal premises, and declared a new structure. Ancient buildings existing on this site long before Ludwig I were simply turned into royal and museum wings, and the collections of antiquities placed inside the Glyptothek and the antiquities collection became the cover. The visitor entering such a building automatically assumes that the building itself is younger than the exhibits. This applies to a very effective device of reappropriation. The original structure is preserved, but its age is assigned to the epoch of its most recent restoration. Now for what is central to our subject, the axis of the complex. The Königsplatz, with its proper layer and lateral wings, is oriented strictly along the north-south line. The northern ray of the axis runs from the square upward and, extended on the map, lands on Stuttgart. This is a major southern German city, the capital of Baden-Württemberg, an important industrial and historical centre, tied to a whole chain of old structures deserving a separate discussion. The southern ray of the axis runs downward, and continued across the Alps, the Balkans and the Bosphorus, reaches Istanbul, that very Constantinople where stood the zero column, Milion, from which the distances of the imperial road system were measured. Let us compare this with the already familiar picture. Milan, a city whose name is etymologically linked to the million in Istanbul. Munich, a city whose central square is geometrically oriented directly on Istanbul. Two major points of southern and central Europe point to one and the same Asian capital. This applies to a regularity that cannot be written off as coincidence. If the axis of Munich happened to hit Istanbul by chance, that would be one oddity. But to the same Istanbul points the etymology of Milan, and to Istanbul look a whole series of other European complexes. The result is a steady vector running from the northwest to the southeast, from the inner Europe to the former center of the Byzantine road network. The second axis, perpendicular, runs from Königsplatz to the west and east, and likewise provides access to specific continental points. Stuttgart on the northern direction is not the final point. The line continues further and lands on more northern nodes. Istanbul on the southern direction is also not the terminus. The axis runs further, all the way to the desert regions of the Middle East. As a result, the Königsplatz functions as the same tetrapylon as the Arc de l'Étoile in Paris. 4 directions, 4 external correspondents, a central structure with symmetrical lateral porticos. This applies to the universality of the architectural canon. Wherever a node of this network stood, it obeys one and the same scheme. Let us draw a line beneath the Munich section. The Königsplatz has preserved almost the full set of elements of the former system. The central gate on the east, the monumental portal complex on the west, 2 symmetrical lateral wings with colonnades, a wide open square, a measured geometric axis on Stuttgart and Istanbul. All this, according to the official version, is a mid-19th century new build, an expression of the Bavarian king's love for classical antiquity. And all this, according to the unofficial reading, is a surviving ancient complex, adapted as a museum, renamed, furnished with new plaques, and built into the biography of Ludwig I as his personal achievement. Munich thus shows us another way of handling the former system, different from the Milanese. In Milan, the old is openly preserved and included in modern life. In Munich, the old is preserved in secret, beneath the signboard of the new. This applies to an important observation. In different cities of Europe, this network was destroyed and concealed in different ways, but its traces could be erased almost nowhere. In Munich, these traces stand in the middle of the central square, in daily view of 500,000 tourists who pass by and ask no questions. We leave Western and Central Europe and move to Russia. Because if the network we are speaking of really existed, it could not have broken off at the Vistula or at the Oder. It must have continued further east, linking the imperial centers of the Russian part of the continent with those very nodes we have already examined in Paris, London, Milan, and Munich. And the first Russian city in which this logic reads, almost without error, is St. Petersburg. A city designed from scratch at the beginning of the 18th century and built according to a geometric scheme more rigid than almost anywhere else in the Europe of that period. This applies to a fact not disputed even by official history. Petersburg is a city of surveyors, topographers, and engineers, not an accidentally grown medieval trading center. Let us begin with the Narva Triumphal Gate. This is one of the best-known Petersburg monuments, situated on Stachek Square in the southern part of the city, on the former Peterhof Road. The official history of this structure is set out with the precision typical of Russian classicism of the 19th century. The first version of the gate was built in 1814 to the design of the architect Giacomo Quarenghi, a temporary wooden construction erected specifically for the ceremonial reception of the Russian troops returning from the foreign campaign after the victory over Napoleon. The second, stone version was raised between 1827 and 1834 to the design of the architect Vasily Petrovich Stasov. It is this version that stands on the site today. Now the reference data of the structure. Height, more than 30 meters. Width, 28 meters. The width of the central span, more than 8 meters. The material, brick faced with sheet copper. On the summit, a bronze chariot drawn by 6 horses, driven by the goddess of victory. On either side of the central opening, 6 Corinthian half columns, with bronze figures of Russian warriors between them. On the attic, the dedication to the participants of the Patriotic War of 1812, the names of the Guards regiments and of the battles. The coordinates of the object, 59 degrees, 54 minutes, 2.7 seconds north latitude, 30 degrees, 16 minutes, 26.2 seconds east longitude. This applies to the level of precision that permits geometrical constructions on a map without approximations. The official purpose of the Narva Gate is a memorial to the heroes of the War of 1812. The version fits entirely within the school textbook and raises no doubts in any visitor, until we begin to look at the axis of the structure. The main axis of the Narva Gate runs strictly from north-northwest to south-southeast, along the direction of the former Peterhof Road, which today is known as Stachek Avenue, and continues beyond the city toward Peterhof and Strelna. On the northern side, this axis leads the eye toward the Gulf of Finland and further toward the Baltic Sea. On the southern side, precisely this axis becomes interesting. Extend this axis on the map in the southern direction. The line runs across the whole of northwestern Russia, crosses the Valdai Hills, passes to the east of Smolensk, continues further south, and lands precisely on Kharkov. The largest city of northeastern Ukraine, a historical node of the Russo-Ukrainian borderlands, one of the old industrial capitals of the entire region. This applies to a line of about 1,300 kilometers in a straight line, which cannot be maintained over such a distance without the instruments of precise geodesy. And if the line is continued still further south, it arrives at Mariupol on the coast of the Sea of Azov. A port city, a nodal point of the Black Sea and Azov region, a meeting place of several ancient trade routes. The Narva Gate, standing in St. Petersburg and dedicated, as its inscription proclaims, to the War of 1812, geometrically points to Kharkov and Mariupol, two cities that have no direct relation to the War of 1812 and lie in two completely different regions. We move on to the second structure, the Moscow Triumphal Gate. It is situated on Moskovsky Avenue in the southern part of Petersburg, closer to the inner urban ring at the intersection with Ligovsky Avenue and the Moscow Highway. Coordinates: 59 degrees, 53 minutes, 28.2 seconds north latitude, 30 degrees, 19 minutes, 9.9 seconds east longitude. Raised between 1834 and 1838 to the design of the same Vasily Stasov. The material, cast iron, with separate sections cast and then assembled on site. Height, 23.2 meters. Width, 36.02 meters. Structurally, the Moscow Triumphal Gate is executed as a freestanding propylaeon portico. 12 cast iron columns of the Doric order placed in a row, with an entablature and an attic above them. The color of the structure, a greenish-grey, corresponding to that of old cast iron. This applies to a rare type of triumphal arch without a central archway, where the function of passage is performed by the colonnade as such. In essence, it is a ready-made propylaeon complex, resembling the Western Milanese and Munich counterparts, only executed in metal rather than stone. The official purpose, a memorial to the victories of Russian troops in the Russo-Turkish and Russo-Persian campaigns of the 1820s, and to the suppression of the Polish uprising of 1830 to 1831. Now for the axis of this structure. The main geometric axis of the Moscow Triumphal Gate runs strictly along the north-south direction, coinciding with the axis of Moskovsky Avenue, which historically served as the ceremonial road from Petersburg toward Moscow and further southward into the empire. On the northern arm of the axis, the line runs toward the center of Petersburg, toward the Admiralty and the Neva. On the southern arm, and here the interesting part begins, the line runs across the entire European part of Russia and lands at once on several southern points lying on a single meridional line. Among them is a series of major Russian and borderland centers, each of which in itself constituted a historical node linked to one of the former imperial roads. This applies to a feature of the southern axis of the Moscow Gate. It does not deliver a single point hit, as the axis of the Narva Gate does on Kharkov, but is distributed across several points, which is characteristic of a trunk vector rather than a point-aimed one. Let us bring the Petersburg section together. Two monumental structures standing some 8 kilometers apart in a straight line. Both built in the first half of the 19th century, both attributed to the military victories of the Russian Empire of that period, both having coordinates precise to the second. One points to the southeast, directly at Kharkov and Mariupol. The other points strictly south, in the meridional direction, covering the southern part of the empire. Together they form two converging geometric vectors, emanating from a single point of the Petersburg urban grid and diverging toward different target points. This applies to the same tetrapylon principle, only unfolded not around one central structure, but between two key gates of the southern direction. Petersburg, therefore, does not merely have triumphal arches. Petersburg has working nodes of the same continental network that we examined in Europe. nodes oriented on specific map-verifiable points 1,000 and more kilometers away. And it is for this reason that the discussion of portal arches must include the Russian capital of the first half of the 19th century on equal terms with Paris, London, Milan, and Munich. We move from Petersburg to Moscow, and here a history awaits us which for our subject is more important than any other Russian example. Because in Moscow, we encounter not a surviving, however reinterpreted, complex, as in Petersburg or Milan, but a system that was deliberately dismantled in the 20th century, according to documents, according to decisions, according to the minutes of party commissions, on dates that can be named precisely 1927, 1936. These are no longer abstract reflections on the catastrophe of the 19th century. These are concrete acts of demolition, recorded in Soviet archives with seals and signatures. Let us begin with the Moscow Gate in Moscow itself, not to be confused with the Moscow Triumphal Gate in Petersburg, which was discussed in the previous section. The Moscow Gate in Moscow is a separate structure, located on Krestyanskaya Zastava Square in the southeastern part of the city on the former Serpukhov Road. Its present coordinates are 55 degrees 44 minutes, 12.4 seconds north latitude, 37 degrees 31 minutes, 12.2 seconds east longitude. The official history of this object is set out as follows. Built between 1829 and 1834 to the design of the architect Osip Ivanovich Bove. The structure was dedicated to the victory of the Russian army in the Patriotic War of 1812. That is, it repeated the official purpose of the Petersburg monuments of the same period. The material, brick faced with white stone. Height, about 28 meters. A central archway framed by paired columns, sculptural groups of Russian warriors, allegorical figures of victory, a bronze chariot on the attic, the complete set of symbols of a Russian triumphal arch. This applies to a structure which, within the canon of the 19th century, stood on one level with the Narva Gate of Petersburg and the Propylaea of Munich. One epoch, one style, one architectural language. Now the key date. In 1936, the Moscow Gate was dismantled. Let us underline the word dismantled. Not rebuilt, not restored, not relocated, but taken apart down to the foundations. The order for the demolition was adopted within the framework of the large program of the reconstruction of Moscow, which in the 30s was unfolding in the center and along the principal avenues of the capital. The official justification, the gate supposedly hindered the widening of the transport arteries. In practice, this meant that in those same years, dozens of landmark structures came under the demolition order. The Red Gate, the Sukharev Tower, the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, the Kazan Cathedral on Red Square, the Simonov Monastery, a series of other objects. An entire architectural epoch was removed from the city within literally a single decade. This applies to one of the largest campaigns for the destruction of urban memory that Europe saw in the 20th century. A copy of the Moscow Gate was restored only between 1960 and 1968, more than 30 years after the dismantling of the original, on its present site at Krestyanskaya Zastava, where the triumphal monument was returned already in a new Soviet interpretation. The modern structure outwardly reproduces the Bove design, but represents a replica and not the original. The material is different, the finish is different. Individual details of the sculptural decoration were reconstructed from drawings and photographs of the 19th century. The geometric axis of the modern copy has been preserved, and according to cartographic constructions, is directed toward Gatchina on the northern arm and toward Kolomna on the southern arm. This applies to two old nodes of the Moscow region, each of which historically was linked to important imperial roads and itself represented an administrative and transport center of its direction. The question that the official history of Moscow prefers to avoid sounds simple. Why was it necessary to dismantle a functioning memorial dedicated to the victory in the War of 1812, under a regime that used precisely this victory as one of its key ideological narratives? One would think that the Soviet power should have preserved such a gate as an emblem of popular patriotism. In practice, it dismantled it. And it dismantled it not by chance in the 30s, but in the same wave of demolitions that swept over the whole ensemble of old Moscow. This applies to the observation that in those years, objects came under the axe not on stylistic or ideological grounds, but on functional ones. What was demolished was what belonged to the old urban grid: arched structures, vertical reference points, temple dominance, towers and gates. The second Moscow object, the Red Gate, a historical triumphal arch in the Baroque style, which stood at the beginning of Myasnitskaya Street at the intersection with the present-day Garden Ring, on the square of the same name. The first wooden version of the gate was raised in 1709 by order of Peter I in honor of the victory at the Battle of Poltava, and the structure originally bore the name of the Triumphal Gate on Myasnitskaya Street. Later the gate was rebuilt, still in wood, and in 1757 it was raised in stone to the design of the architect Dmitry Ukhtomsky. It was precisely the stone version that received in popular usage the name of the Red Gate, because of the color of the painting and the overall decorative effect. The parameters of the stone version: height, about 26 meters, 3 archways, a powerful central passage, and 2 lateral ones, a rich sculptural decoration with allegorical figures, cartouches and monograms, and on the summit, a gilded statue of Fame. Next to the gate, literally a few meters away, stood the Church of the Three Hierarchs at the Red Gate, a temple belonging to a single urban ensemble with the arch. This applies to the classical scheme of the portals of the former system: an archway plus an adjoining vertical, whether it be a bell tower, a temple tower, or a commemorative column. In Moscow, such a paired element was precisely the Red Gate and the Church of the Three Hierarchs. Now the dates of the demolition. In 1927, the Red Gate and the Church of the Three Hierarchs were taken down, both objects within one and the same operation. The square was cleared and the surviving toponym of the Red Gate remained only in the name of the metro station opened on this spot several years later. The official reason for the demolition, the same as in the case of the Moscow Gate, the reconstruction of the streets, the widening of the roadway, the needs of the new transport. In fact, the removal of a paired node, arch and vertical at one stroke. This applies to an important regularity. In the demolitions of the 20s and 30s in Moscow, what was destroyed were not only separate buildings, but bundles of buildings working as a single architectural node. Let us assemble the Moscow picture. 2 key triumphal structures of the city were destroyed in the 20th century. The Red Gate, together with its adjoining church, in 1927. The Moscow Gate, in 1936. Both dates fall within one historical wave of the mass reconstruction of the capital. Both operations were carried out within the framework of a state program and not of spontaneous destruction. Both victims were triumphal arches, that is, precisely those structures which, within our subject, are the nodes of the former network. This applies to a direct observation. The dismantling of the portals in Moscow was not accidental. It was part of a general process in which the old urban geometry was purposefully replaced by a new one. The geometry of the 20th century had no need of arches as functional points. It needed wide avenues, free thoroughfares, and empty squares for parades. And here one further touch is added to the overall picture, which makes it complete. The restored copy of the Moscow Gate in the 60s was returned to its place, but on the functional level, this is already not the same structure that stood before 1936. This is a monument to a monument. The Red Gate has not been restored at all, and the square itself, which bore its name, is today a traffic interchange. Moscow, as a result of the 20th century, remained without the key nodes which, within the former system, served as the points of southern and eastern connection, and only the Petersburg complex of the Narva and Moscow gates preserved what Moscow lost definitively. This applies to the difference in the fate of the two Russian capitals within the 20th century. One preserved the nodes of the former network, even if in a reinterpreted form, while the other was deprived of them almost entirely. And now, the strongest argument of the whole discussion, because up to this point we have been dealing with capitals and metropolises: Paris, London, Milan, Munich, Petersburg, Moscow. Cities of the first rank, to which monumental structures and geometric axes of worldwide scale belong by status. But what if the same arches, with the same axes, with the same hits on distant targets, are to be found in a city that was never an imperial capital, nor a major European hub, nor a point of world decisions? In deep provincia, in the south of Russia, in the steppe, far from the principal highways. If even one such example is found, then the matter lies not in the ambitions of a particular city and not in the wish to imitate Paris. The matter lies in the fact that this city was originally part of the very grid about which we are speaking. And such an example does exist. It is called Novocherkassk. Let us give it a reference datasheet. Novocherkassk is a town in Rostov Oblast, lying in the steppe between the Tuzlov and Aksai rivers, about 40 kilometers to the northeast of Rostov-on-Don. The population is around 160,000. It was founded in 1805 by Ataman Matvey Platov as the capital of the land of the Don host, that is, as the administrative center of the Don Cossacks. From 1920 onwards, its capital status was lost. Today, it is a quiet provincial town with a historical center, the Voiskovoy Ascension Cathedral, and a number of classicist buildings of the first third of the 19th century. This applies to a typical southern Russian provincial center, of which there were dozens in the Russian Empire and in Soviet Russia, with no particular pretensions to the role of a node of world geometry. And yet, in this town stand two triumphal arches. Not one, as in most provincial towns of Europe, if they exist at all, but two. They were erected in one and the same year of 1817 by decision of the same Ataman Platov and dedicated to the memory of the Don Cossacks who participated in the War of 1812 and in the foreign campaigns of the Russian army. The official version is the same as that of the Petersburg, Moscow, and European monuments of the same epoch: military glory, gratitude to the victors, and adornment of the young capital of the host. This applies to the same canon we have already read on a dozen other examples. The material is brick, faced with hewn stone, with columns, attics, and bas-reliefs. The height of both arches is around 15 meters, the width about 20. A central span, two lateral passages, decorative sculptural elements, dedicatory inscriptions. In outward appearance, Russian classicism of the first third of the 19th century, of the same model as the Narva Gate of Petersburg or the Moscow Gate of Bove. But the most interesting thing begins when we look at their orientation. The first, the northern arch of Novocherkassk. Its coordinates: 47 degrees, 25 minutes, 38.0 seconds north latitude, 40 degrees 5 minutes, 48.3 seconds east longitude. The structure is placed at the northern exit of the town, on the former highway toward Voronezh and further onward toward central Russia. The axis of the arch is oriented strictly along the south-southwest, north-northeast direction. The northern arm of this axis runs into the steppe, and according to the data of cartographic constructions, yields no precise hit on any major internal Russian city. The line simply dissipates over empty space. This applies to an important observation, of which we shall say more at the end of this section. the southern arm of the axis of the northern arch behaves in a completely different manner. It runs across the Sea of Azov, across the territory of modern Turkey, and lands at once on two geographically measured points. The first, Kayseri, one of the most ancient cities of Anatolia, the historic capital of Cappadocia, a node through which the caravan routes of the ancient and medieval world passed. The second, Mersin, a major Mediterranean port on the southern coast of Turkey, part of the network of the ancient Cilician trading centres. And if the axis is extended still further south, the line crosses the eastern Mediterranean and lands on Cairo, the capital of Egypt, one of the principal nodes of all of northern Africa, reaching with its roots into deep antiquity, to Memphis, to Heliopolis, to the pyramids of Giza. This applies to a line of about 2,200 kilometers from a provincial southern Russian town to the capital of the ancient Egyptian region. To maintain such a direction without precise geodesy is impossible. The second arch is the western one. Its coordinates 47 degrees, 24 minutes, 17.8 seconds north latitude, 40 degrees, 5 minutes, 3.5 seconds east longitude. The structure stands at the western exit of the town on the former highway toward Rostov-on-Don. The axis of the western arch is oriented along the direction west-southwest, east-northeast. That is, at a small but precise angle to the strictly latitudinal direction. The southwestern arm of the axis of the western arch runs across the Black Sea steppe, across Crimea, across the Black Sea, across Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean, and lands on Homs. Not on the Syrian Homs, but on its Libyan namesake, the Libyan Homs on the Mediterranean coast, an old port town located near the ruins of the ancient Leptis Magna. This is one of the principal sites of Roman and early Byzantine North Africa, an important node of ancient Mediterranean trade. The distance from Novocherkassk to the Libyan Homs in a straight line amounts to 2,721 kilometers. Let us underline this figure, not a round 3,000, not a smoothed 2,500, but precisely 2,721 kilometers. This applies to the device of sniper precision. Had the author of the theory simply been making things up, he would have written roughly 2,500 kilometers. A precise figure down to the single unit indicates that the construction was made not by eye, but by geodesic instruments. The northeastern arm of the axis of the western arch behaves likewise very clearly. It runs across the Don steppe and lands on Volgograd, the former Stalingrad, the former Tsaritsyn, a major Volga node, a key point at the junction of land and water routes between the Caspian and the Azov seas. Volgograd in this scheme stands as the Near Eastern correspondent of the western arch of Novocherkassk, and Homs as its far southwestern correspondent. Two vectors from a single point, an East Russian and a North African one. This applies to exactly the same scheme we saw in Paris and Munich. One arch holds at once two directions spread across the cardinal points. Now let us bring both arches of Novocherkassk into a single picture. The northern arch points to Kayseri, Mersin and Cairo. The western arch points to Homs in Libya and to Volgograd. A total of 4 confirmed external correspondents for one small provincial town, plus the intermediate points along the axes through which these lines pass: the Crimean coast, Anatolia, the eastern Mediterranean. This applies to a configuration which in density does not yield to metropolitan nodes. Novocherkassk is geometrically linked to Africa more strongly than most European megacities. Now the question for the sake of which this section exists: why does a provincial Cossack town of the first third of the 19th century have 2 triumphal arches, each of which points to Middle Eastern and North African ancient centers? How is this connected to the War of 1812 and to the foreign campaigns of the Russian army which ended in Paris and not in Cairo. How is this connected to the life of the Don Cossacks, whose principal interests lay in the south of Russia, in Crimea and the Caucasus, but in no way in Libya? The official version offers no answer. The arches are explained by the usual list: military glory, an adornment of the capital of the host, the memory of the campaigns. But not a single item on this list explains axes that point to Cairo and to Homs. The unofficial version answers at once. Novocherkassk, at the moment of its founding, was embedded into the same geometric grid that already existed by the time of its construction. Ataman Platov and the architects of his arches did not invent the directions out of their heads. They placed the structures as the old coordinate system demanded, the same system according to which the nodes in Paris, Milan, Munich and Petersburg had been laid out. It is simply that in the provincia, this fact remained less concealed. In capitals, the arches are surrounded by such a dense layer of official rhetoric about emperors and generals that the geometry recedes into the background. In Novocherkassk, it is visible at once. The town is small, the monuments are few, the dedicatory inscriptions about the Cossacks in no way explain why the axes strike into Libya and Egypt. This applies to an effect which in sociology is called the province does not conceal. In the periphery, the old systems are preserved more faithfully than in the renewed capitals, and their traces are harder to disguise. And it is precisely for this reason that Novocherkassk, a small southern Russian town with a population of 160,000, turns out to be within our subject one of the strongest pieces of evidence. Not Paris, not London, not Milan, but a provincial Cossack centre with 2 brick and stone arches standing at its step exits, each of which points across seas and continents to points of which its founders officially should not even have known. 2,721 kilometres to Homs, 2,200 to Cairo, figures which without precise geodesy are not placed on a map. This applies to a direct proof that the network we are speaking of was real, and that Novocherkassk stood within its southern Russian sector. We now move to the very east of the continent, because after Paris, London, Milan, Munich, Petersburg, Moscow and Novocherkassk, one natural question remains. Does this network end somewhere at the borders of European Russia, or does it extend further, across the Urals, across Siberia, to the shores of the Pacific Ocean? If the network was truly continental, then it must be present in the Far East as well. And such a point on the map does exist. It is called Blagoveshchensk. This applies to that stage of our subject at which it changes from European geometry into a Eurasian geometry, covering the whole mainland from the Atlantic to the Amur. Let us begin with the reference data of the town itself. Blagoveshchensk is the administrative center of the Amur region, situated on the left bank of the Amur River at the mouth of the Zaya River. The population is about 200,000. It was founded in 1856 as the Ust-Zaysky military post, and in 1858 was renamed Blagoveshchensk and received the status of a town. The distance to Moscow in a straight line is about 5,600 kilometers. The distance to Beijing, about 1,300. This applies to a town that geographically lies closer to the Chinese capital than to the Russian one, and which, throughout its history, stood precisely as an outpost on the border of the empire. Directly opposite Blagoveshchensk, on the right bank of the Amur, lies the Chinese city of Heihe. That is, the state border between Russia and China runs literally through the middle of the river, and the two cities look at each other across its 2 banks. This applies to an exceptional situation, one of the few cases in the world where major cities of 2 different states stand directly across from each other over a narrow water boundary. And it is precisely in this town, at the very edge of the empire, that a triumphal arch was erected at the end of the 19th century. Let us give its data. The Triumphal Arch of Blagoveshchensk was raised in 1891. The structure represented a classical triumphal construction, a central opening about 20 meters high, crowned by an attic with two lateral turrets, rich sculptural decoration, icons in niches, dedicatory inscriptions. The material was brick on a stone foundation, with white stone facing and gilded details. In its architectural model, the arch stands close to the Russian triumphal structures of the 18th and 19th centuries, only adapted to the East Siberian aesthetics with its tent-like finials. This applies to the same canon in which the Narva Gate of Petersburg and the arches of Novocherkassk were built, only with local decorative accents, the official pretext for the erection. According to all pre-revolutionary documents and reference books, the arch was raised in honor of the visit to Blagoveshchensk by the heir Tsarevich Nikolai Alexandrovich, the future Emperor Nicholas II, during his eastern journey in 1891. The Tsarevich passed through the town as part of a long Asian itinerary that included China, Japan, and eastern Siberia, and in memory of this visit, the town authorities placed a triumphal arch in the riverside zone. The version is clean, convenient, and fully conforming to the school framework. This applies to a typical official pretext we have already seen in the cases of the arches of Paris, Petersburg, and Novocherkassk. Each time a respectable figure is found in whose honor the monument was supposedly raised. Now the further fate of the structure. During the Civil War and the subsequent social upheavals, the arch was substantially damaged. In 1936, in the very same epoch when the Moscow Gate was being demolished in Moscow, the Blagoveshchensk arch was finally dismantled. The coincidence of dates of the two demolitions at opposite edges of the empire is curious in itself. In the 21st century, the arch was built anew. Between 2003 and 2005, a copy of the structure was raised in Blagoveshchensk according to historical drawings and photographs, reproducing the original appearance as closely as possible. Today, this copy stands on the embankment of the Amur, in immediate proximity to the Border River, and is one of the principal symbols of the town. This applies to a rare case in which a portal lost in the 20th century was restored already in modern times, but only after more than 70 years of absence. Now for the reason that all of this has a bearing on our subject. The axis of the Triumphal Arch of Blagoveshchensk is oriented in the direction from north-northeast to south-southwest, closer to the strictly northern direction. The northeastern arm of the axis runs across the Amur region toward Yakutia and northeastern Siberia, and yields no precise hit on any major Russian city. But the opposite, southwestern arm of the axis, extended across the Amur River and further through the territory of northeastern China, lands precisely on Harbin. This applies to a city that has a particular significance for our subject. Harbin is the largest city of the Chinese province of Heilongjiang, the administrative center of the whole of northeastern China. The population is around 10 million in the agglomeration. The history of the city is built in a remarkable way. Harbin was in fact laid out at the end of the 19th century by Russian engineers and builders as a nodal station of the Chinese Eastern Railway, one of the most important transport arteries between Russia and the Pacific Ocean. Up to the beginning of the 20th century, Harbin remained predominantly Russian in population and in architecture. This applies to the fact that the connection between Blagoveshchensk and Harbin ran not only along rails, but also along an engineering continuity. Both cities at a certain point belonged to a single Russian Far Eastern contour. The distance from Blagoveshchensk to Harbin in a straight line amounts to about 550 kilometers. On a map, this line runs almost precisely across the border Chinese province, crosses the Sungari River, and arrives exactly at the center of Harbin. The axis of the arch holds this direction without deviation. This applies to that level of geodesic precision we have already encountered in Paris, Munich, Petersburg, and Novocherkassk. the same canon, the same principle, the same result. And now, the principal question to the official version. If the arch was raised in 1891 solely in honor of the passage of Tsarevich Nikolai Alexandrovich through Blagoveshchensk, then what does its geometric axis have to do with Harbin? Especially in view of the fact that in 1891, Harbin as a city did not yet exist. The construction of the Chinese Eastern Railway and the founding of the urban core of Harbin fell on 1898 and 1899, that is, on a period 7 to 8 years after the erection of the arch. It turns out that the axis of the Blagoveshchensk monument pointed to a spot that at the moment of its construction did not yet exist on the map. This applies to the very inconvenient contradiction that is impossible to explain within the official version. The unofficial version answers simply. The axis of the Blagoveshchensk arch was laid out not in 1891 and not by the architects of the Tsarevich. It was laid out long before, along the same old continental grid into which Blagoveshchensk, as a point on the map, fitted even before its official founding in the middle of the 19th century. The Russian power, which came into the Amur region in the 1800s, placed its border town on the site of a node of an already existing system. And when a new railway center was needed on the other side of the border, it too was placed where the old geometry required, at the point on which the Blagoveshchensk axis had long been pointing. This applies to a regularity according to which the entire transport infrastructure of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the Russian Far East and in northeastern China unfolded along lines that had been laid out long before the appearance of locomotives and the telegraph. Let us draw a line under the far eastern section. The Triumphal Arch of Blagoveshchensk, a small provincial monument on the bank of the Amur, within the framework of official history, is a tribute to the passage of the air. Within the framework of geographic reality, it is a node with a precise geometric axis pointing across a state border at one of the largest cities of northeastern China, which officially arose later than the arch itself. This applies to the direct continuation of the same logic we saw at Novocherkassk. A provincial point preserves the signs of operation within the common grid more plainly than metropolitan monuments. And if Novocherkassk closes the southern sector of this grid, linking it to Africa through Cairo and Homs, then Blagoveshchensk closes the eastern sector, linking it to China through Harbin. Two small Russian provincial towns, one in the south and one in the far east, turn out to be two final confirmed nodes of one and the same system, covering the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Amur. This applies to the conclusion for the sake of which our whole discussion was begun. The portal arches were never monuments of local glory. The portal arches were points on a single geometric grid of a single civilization. It is time to bring the conversation to a close. We have traveled from Paris to Blagoveshchensk, from Madrid to Cairo, from London to Harbin. Dozens of arches, dozens of coordinates, dozens of precise hits on the map. And now, when all these points have been laid out before us, we can at last raise our eyes and look at the picture as a whole, as it forms itself out of all the examples we have examined. Let us begin with the fact that in Russia alone, far fewer structures have been preserved than originally stood on its territory. Official history offers a convenient and harmless version on this matter, which sounds in every reference book and on every guided tour. At first, the triumphal arches were temporary wooden, raised in haste for a particular celebration. Then they were replaced by stone ones, more durable. Then the stone ones were restored, rebuilt, occasionally renovated. Then, for various reasons, most often supposedly due to dilapidation or the widening of streets, they were demolished. And in the 21st century, a new item has been added. Today, across the country, new arches are being erected, already frankly souvenir ones, to adorn the city entrances and to fill in the historical gaps. This applies to the sequence wood, stone, restoration, demolition, new build, which looks like a natural evolution of urban architecture and induces no one to ask superfluous questions. In this sequence, everything appears plausible until one begins to count by dates and by geography. What exactly was demolished, when and where? And then the tidy evolution unravels into a completely different picture. The Red Gate in Moscow, 1927. The Moscow Gate in Moscow, 1936. The Blagoveshchensk Arch, 1936. The Sukharev Tower, the Kazan Cathedral on Red Square, the Simonov Monastery, and dozens of other verticals and archways, the same interval between the 1920s and the 1930s. This applies not to a random renewal of cities, but to a single focused wave that came across the whole country in one decade and hit precisely the nodes of the former system. And within the same logic, the events of the 19th century that we have mentioned throughout our conversation become comprehensible. It was in the 19th century that on the territory of Russia, as on the territory of all of Europe, the systematic taking of the portals out of operation began. Some objects were destroyed physically, and in their place either temples or administrative buildings or simply empty squares were set. Others were rebuilt in such a way that their functional part, the porticos, the internal wings, the symmetrical lateral stations, either disappeared entirely or was turned into a decorative dummy. Still others remained standing outwardly whole, but with the equipment dismantled, could no longer function, and turned into beautiful but empty monuments. This applies to a process which, within the framework of official history, is never named by a single word, but which, by the combination of its signs, reads as a unified operation for the dismantling of the continental system. Let us return now to the main thesis with which our conversation began. Triumphal arches were never monuments to local military victories. Neither the Parisian Arc de l'Étoile, it is not a monument to Napoleonic triumphs, nor the London Wellington Arch. It is not a monument to Waterloo. Nor the Petersburg Narva Gate. It is not a monument to the War of 1812. Nor the Red Gate in Moscow. It is not a monument to the Battle of Poltava. All these dedications are official plaques, stuck over structures which had an entirely different purpose and a far earlier origin. This applies to the device we have already analyzed. A new power does not demolish the old, but rewrites it under its own name, building into its own biography the work of others. What, then, stood behind these structures in reality? From the sum of everything we have examined, the answer can be formulated firmly. In the recent past, before the upheavals of the 19th century, on the territory of Europe, Russia, and North Africa, there existed a single civilization with a single engineering culture. The centers of this civilization were major cities, each of which maintained its own triumphal arch or group of arches. Paris, London, Milan, Munich, Madrid, Petersburg. But not only these. The system included provincial nodes as well. Novocherkassk in the south of Russia, Blagoveshchensk in the far east, dozens of other points of the second and third order across the whole space of the continent. And all these nodes were linked to one another along precise geometric lines, running with measured geodesic accuracy across seas, mountains, and state borders. This applies to a scale which, within the framework of the ordinary history of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, cannot be explained by the usual means of communication, by messengers, by horses, by sailing ships, and by railways. The network operated. The network had a technical basis, symmetrical porticos on either side of the arches fulfilling the function of synchronous emitters. The network had an architectural canon, unified proportions, unified sizes of the openings, unified distances between the supports. The network had its semantics, the imperial lion, the cornucopia, the oar, the allegories of victory, the figure of the Queen of the New Order, a common language of symbols scattered across the stones from Paris to Novocherkassk. And the network had its geography, from Athens and Volubilis in the south to Amsterdam and Tartu in the north, from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to Harbin in the east. This applies to a description which, by its level of coherence, coverage, and technological consistency, exceeds the bounds of any contemporary concept of pre-industrial Europe. In the 19th century, this network was taken out of operation. How exactly? This is a separate conversation, far beyond the bounds of a single subject on arches. Whether it was wars, climatic catastrophes, technological events, a change of regimes, deliberate operations of new elites, on this matter different versions exist, and we have not analyzed them in this material. It is sufficient for us to record the result. At the exit from the 19th century, the former civilization ceases to exist as a single system. Its imperial symbols are declared to be allegories, its engineering nodes, monuments to military glory, its technical function, architectural decoration. And already in the 20th century, a final layer is added, the mass demolition of even what still stood and kept silent. This applies to how a working communication system turns first into a web of dead monuments and then into a collection of beautiful ruins and empty squares. And from this comes the main image to which our whole conversation leads. In the recent past, there existed a single country, not necessarily in the present-day sense of a state with borders and passports, but a single civilizational space, linked by a common technology, a common architectural language, a common system of measurements, and a common network of long-distance communication. Triumphal arches were its nerve nodes, its stations, its points of transition. They stood in every significant city, in the capital and in the province, and on the outskirts, and on the far eastern border, because the system had to work for all corners of this single country, and not for some one chosen capital alone. Today, from this country, there remain arches built to the same canon in different cities of different states. They stand at ceremonial points, adorn squares, serve as a backdrop for tourist photographs and wedding shoots. People pass under them every day, not knowing that they are stepping through a point which once linked their city to another, 2,000, 3,000 kilometers away. And this whole network, from Paris to Blagoveshchensk, from Athens to Volubilis, from Amsterdam to Harbin, is still present on the maps, if one knows how to draw straight lines across them through the axes of the surviving arches. This applies to the final observation, for the sake of which it was worth beginning the whole conversation at all. Triumphal arches are not monuments to anyone's wars. They are the portals of a former civilization, and they still point to their targets despite all the rebuildings, relocations, and rewritten plaques through 2 centuries of oblivion, calmly and precisely, toward where they were once aimed. Here we have come to the finale of this long conversation. The road turned out to be a lengthy one, from the hill of Shiloh in Paris to the embankment of the Amur in Blagoveshchensk, from ancient Volubilis in Morocco to the steppe town of Novocherkassk in the Rostov region. If you have watched this video to this very minute, it means the subject has gripped you in earnest. And it means you are one of those viewers for whose sake this channel exists at all. Now a short request. If in this material you have found for yourself at least one fact that made you stop and think, place a like under the video. This is the simplest way of saying, the work was not done in vain, such subjects need to be told further. Every thumbs up raises the video in search and in recommendations, and it is precisely in this way that our channel is found by people like you, thinking men who have grown tired of the handsome fairy tales of official history and who wish to see the picture in the form in which it truly comes together. If you are here for the first time, subscribe to the channel. The Archive of Inconvenient Facts is not about loud sensations for a single evening, but about quiet, substantial work with those subjects which are usually passed over in silence. large wars, forgotten empires, global battles, kings whose real roles in history have been rewritten, portal complexes, lost technologies, erased cities. Here you will find everything about which the textbooks and mass television prefer to keep silent. And be sure to press the bell next to the subscribe button. Without the bell, the new videos of our channel may simply fail to reach you. The algorithms are arranged in such a way that they show far from everything one is subscribed to. A bell turned on is your guarantee that the next major release will not pass you by. And the next releases are already in preparation. Ahead lie analyses of other nodes of this same network, other cities, other lines, other inconvenient facts, gathered piece by piece over months of work. Write in the comments under this video, is there a triumphal arch or an old gate in your own town or in the town of your parents of which few people know? Where does it point if you open a map and draw a straight line along its axis? What city turns out to be at the other end of that line? The most interesting observations of the viewers will become the basis of a separate release. The map of this network grows by our common efforts, and your observation may turn out to be the next key node. Take care of yourselves, of those close to you, and of your ability to ask inconvenient questions. This is the most precious thing that has remained with us from that single country of which we spoke today. Until we meet in the next video, on the channel, the Archive of Inconvenient Facts.